everybody sort of logs on because it won't show up for people who log on late.
Oh, I see.
Right as you get started. Yeah, we're gonna get started in a minute or so. People are still logging on, so.
I see. Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Here comes everybody, 1 minute late, just like a real seminar. Don't wait till everything wait till it's time to start.
Good to see everyone.
It is good to see everybody. George, we're going to do some of these in person once. Hey, are we going to do some of these in person once COVID is over?
I think we should get the group together, right?
A big virtual ITM for everybody who's been
anybody
coming
up
to
for
these
getting
things?
Together in person? No one's shaking their heads.
Yeah.
Dorian's like, no, never.
Exactly.
I don't want to see you guys. Yeah, we have to kind of plan like the grand opening, right? It should be like a holiday. So cool.
Good.
I have to get the vaccine first, George. I haven't gotten my vaccine yet.
No, not yet. Okay. Well, the rest of us have, so you're in good company. It's coming, right? Go ahead, Kim. Sorry.
Someday we'll get there. All right,
Yeah,
we're gonna get started.
I don't know, not for us, but
I mean, I had to drive 2 hours to get mine, but they were out there at least. Okay, so let's get underway here. I'm going to post a link to the slides in the chat in a moment. But today we're happy to have Trang talking about the dynamics of global sourcing. You have an hour. People just break in with questions as they come up. They'll just unmute themselves and interrupt you just like in a regular seminar. Okay.
All right.
All right. Yep. Go ahead.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks, George, for inviting me to give this talk. It was really a great honor. So the main goal of this paper is to study the exit and entry decision of a firm into different import markets. So the broad motivations to focus on the global sourcing come from the fact that input trade actually accounts for 2/3 of global trade. And that means the majority of goods that are transferred across international borders are actually parts and components instead of final goods. There's also evidence that having access to foreign input is important for a number of firm-level outcomes, such as productivities, a number of product varieties, or product quality. And those in turn is going to be important for the aggregate welfare gains from trade. And why should we care about the firm dynamics here, which hopefully I don't have to convince this group. So besides the fact that there's a lot of key behaviors of firm exit and entries that cannot be explained by static models, we also have the result that static models do not approximate the steady state of dynamic models, and welfare gains trade cost reductions can be bigger in models with dynamic decisions compared with those with static decisions. However, most of what we learn about the firm level dynamics in international trade has come from the export literature, whereas there are very few papers that study the import dynamics. So that leads us to questions, and that is, are the importer and the exporter dynamics similar, or is there anything about the import dynamics that we cannot infer from our existing knowledge on the exporter? So on one hand, it seems that the importers exhibit many similar behaviors to exporters. And in this paper, I focus on the exit and entry behaviors. And that is, we see there's persistent in the import status, and there's also low entry and exit rates of importing. So also a firm past import decisions is an important predictor for its current import decisions. We have observed this in many different countries in the US, manufacturing, also in Chile, Colombia, and in these papers, I document the same behavior for example, Chinese importers. But for the sake of time, I'm not gonna present this behavior in these presentations. So this behavior has been explained fairly well in the past with models that feature the sunk entry cost in combination with uncertainty about future profits. However, there's one important difference between the export and import decisions, and that is whereas the export markets are often assumed to be independent under constant marginal cost assumptions, we cannot make the same assumption about the import decisions. And the reason is because when firms decide to purchase input from one market, that decision is going to affect the firm marginal cost and therefore change the firm optimization problem when it's considered other markets to import from. So in other words, the import markets are interdependent in the firm's productions. So what's going to be the new policy implication here if we were to put together the sunk entry cost of importing with interdependence across country? We know that from with the sunk cost, temporary trade policy changes can potentially generate long-lasting impacts. And because of the interdependence across countries, this impact is going to be present in both the targeted and non-targeted markets as well. Now, even though this effect on non-targeted markets is also inherent in the standard gravity models through multilateral resistance or terms of trade, what is new here is that even if we ignore this general equilibrium effects, we can still achieve third country effects through the change in the firm level decisions. However, this is actually a very complex problem to study, and the paper is aiming to contribute to the literature by addressing one particular questions, and that is there sunk cost of importing, and how do we quantify this sunk cost? Right? This alone is quite challenging for a couple of reasons. First, we have here is a dynamic problem, and that is the firm decisions today is going to affect not only the current profit, but also affect the expected future value as well. But this is actually an old problem, and we have many tools to deal with this problem. Right? Now, what is new here is that the size of the problem that we're facing is much bigger than a typical dynamic discrete choice problem. For example, if say a firm consider to import from a set of 40 countries, instead of making a decision in each of these countries separately, the firms would have to consider the combination of all of this country, and therefore the number of feasible choices that the firm face is going to be about 1 trillion choices, which is enormous. And then the last challenge is particular to the import decisions, and that is the interdependence here is placed in the marginal cost of the firm. And because the dynamic decision of a firm depends on its static decisions, that also means that we have to deal with interdependence in both the static and also the dynamic decisions. So how I'm going to address this problem? First, I'm going to introduce a dynamic multi-country model of importing with heterogeneous firm. The model is basically going to build on a static model in Entrust, Ford, and Tiltonot, or I refer to as AFT, to allow for an intra-temporal interdependence across country in the productions. And then I'm going to introduce the dynamic linkage through the country-specific sunk cost that firm pays when it imports from a new market. Then to estimate the sunk entry cost, I'm going to follow a moment inequality method similar to Morales-Chu and Zahler 2019, or I refer to as MSZ here. So the key assumption here is going to be a reveal preferences assumptions. That is, if we observe a firm imports from a new location, then that must implies that the gains in the firm current variable profit and the gain in expected future values is larger than the entry cost the firm incurs. And similarly, if a firm import from an old location, then that implies that the gain for this firm is bigger than the continuation cost the firm incurs, right? So under this observations, then we can get the bound for the entry cost and the continuation cost, and the sunk cost is going to be the difference between these two. Now, here we can anticipate that the challenge is going to mainly come from the left-hand side of this inequality, and that is how do we estimate this change, the gain in profit here. So we have an old problem that is the change in the expected future value, and then we have a new problem that is the change in the variable profit, which is now depends on other countries that the firm importing from due to the interdependence across countries. And the data I'm using is going to come from a sample of Chinese chemical producer between 2000 and 2006 from the top 40 countries. Here is a summary of the paper. First, I found evidence for the interdependence across countries. In particular, I found that countries are complementary in the firm productions. By that, I mean the marginal benefit of importing from one country is increasing in the number of countries that a firm is importing from. And this result is interestingly consistent with what AFT found in the context of US manufacturing firm. Next, I found that the continuation cost range between 0.5 and 1.8 million RMB. And to put that in relative terms, that is between 8 to 27% of the gain in revenue when firm import from a country. And the entry cost is between 1 and 3.2 million RMB, or is between 13% to 40% of the revenue gain. The joint estimation of these two costs going to show that the entry cost is bigger than the continuation cost, and that is evidence for the sunk cost of importing. Next, I also checked the degree to which a static interdependence matters for how that affects the dynamic cost, in the sense that I impose that country are either independent or substitute instead of complementary. And I found that in this case, the sunk cost estimate is actually becomes smaller compared to the benchmark case when countries are complementarity. So this is potentially interesting, hinting at an interesting future question, and that is, how does the static interdependence going to affect the dynamic implication of trade policy? So then for the next one result, I re-estimate the model while allowing for dynamic productivity gains to address a concern that the persistent that there may be learning from importing, and the persistent that we observe in the data may be contributed by the gain in productivity instead of the smaller cost of importing. And what I found is that if firm internalizes dynamic productivity gains of importing, the estimate for both the entry cost and the continuation cost go up, but the difference between the two remains pretty much the same. And then finally, I also checked how different experience in the foreign markets also affect the sunk cost of importing by estimating a model that allows a firm to both import goods and export final goods to multiple countries. And what I found is that a new importer is going to pay a smaller entry cost if it has prior export experience in the same market. And another interesting result here is that the import entry cost that I estimate is still about 3 times bigger than the export entry cost, even though the models really don't have any intuitions to why the import cost should be bigger. But I would be happy to listen to any suggestions here. Right. So the paper is related to a number of literatures. First is related to a small literature on the import dynamics, but one of this existing paper has focused on a 2-country setting and do not account for the interdependence across countries. The paper is also related to a literature on the export dynamics with interdependent market, and most closely related to my paper is more or less Shu and Zahler. And the main difference here is that in this paper, they place the interdependence in the sunk cost, but still rely on a constant marginal cost assumptions. And therefore, the static decision of the firm is still independent. Whereas in the setting of import, we would have to deal with interdependent in both the static and the dynamic decisions. And then finally, this paper contributes to a very recent literature on moment inequalities in international trade by allowing for an additional source of interdependence across market, and also allowing for interaction between different trade margins. Okay. So in the next few slides, I'm going to present the model in this paper. And again, this is basically built on the the static model in on transport and tilt and out. Right? So here's the setting. There's going to be J's country with symmetric CS demand, and sigma here denote the elasticity of substitutions. There are 2 sectors in this frame model. There's intermediate goods sector, which is characterized by perfect competitions, and following Eaton and Cotton's, I'm going to assume that there's the productivity of input production in each country is going to follow a fracture distributions. One key parameter in this distributions is theta, which captures the dispersion of technology across inputs, across different input within the same market. And then the final goods sector is going to be characterized by monopolistic competitions. Now, in the baseline, I'm going to assume that final goods is not traded, but eventually I would also allow for firms to be able to trade, sell final good in different foreign market as well. I'm going to focus on the final good producer at the home country here. And so this producer is going to use a continuum of inputs in order to produce a variety of final goods. And the inputs are imperfect substitutes. There are three type costs that this producer has to pay if it wants to import inputs from a foreign country. So first there's variable cost, and there's also country-specific fixed cost, and also sunk cost of importing as well. Here's the timing of the firm decisions. First, the firm is going to choose the set of countries to import from, which I denote as JMIT. And then it's going to decide how much to import from within each sort of country within this set. And then finally, it will set the price of the final good. Okay. Now, in this environment, the marginal cost of the firm conditional on the firm choice of import countries is going to be a function of the firm productivity, which is the standard component. And then it's also be a function of the input cost, the second component here. And this second component basically summarizes the price that the price of the inputs that firm are sourced from different countries. So this second term here is basically similar to the price index in ethylene cotton, but we can think about this term as the price index for an individual firm. Then under CS demand and monopolistic competitions, the final good, the price of final good is simply a constant markup over the marginal cost. We can also write the value of the functions of revenues this way, and the variable profit is simply a fraction of the revenue of the firm. Okay. Now, one key feature of this model is that it can generate the interdependence across import markets. And to formalize this idea, let me introduce a new term here, and that is the marginal revenue of a country at the set JM, which I would denote by the by RM at JM. So the marginal revenue of a country is defined as the change in total revenue when we add or drop a country from the set JM. It's turned out that we can actually have a closed form expression for this term. So the marginal revenue, RM at JM, is a product of two components. The first one is the rate of change in marginal cost saving when we add or drop a country to the set. And the second one is the total revenue of the country, the total revenue of the firm at the set JM. And it's turned out that the rate of change in marginal cost is decreasing in the number of countries that a firm importing from, but the total revenue is increasing in the number of countries that a firm is importing from. And the intuition is this: when firm import from more countries, then it's going to have a higher chance to find low-cost supplier, and that's going to reduce the marginal cost of the firm and therefore increase the revenue in equilibrium. So that just captures the scale effect. At the same time, if firm already import from many countries, then the marginal contribution of each individual country is going to be smaller. And by the same logics, when we add another country to this set, the rate of change in marginal cost is going to be also smaller. And this is the substitution effect across country. And which effect dominates is going to depend on the value of sigma, which is the elasticity of substitution, and also on theta, which is the technology dispersion across country. When sigma minus 1 over theta is smaller than 1, we have a substitute case. So in this case, the substitution effect dominates the scale effects, and the marginal revenue of a country is going to be decreasing in the number of countries that a firm is importing from. On the other hand, if this expression is larger than 1, then we have a complementary case, and with this is exactly equal to 1, then we're going to have an independent case in which the value of a country does not depend on other countries that a firm is importing from. Now, next, I'm going to introduce a dynamic linkage by imposing that firm has to pay a sunk cost whenever it's import from a country that is did not import in the last period. And then there's also a fixed cost here that firm pays, which is independently of the firm past decisions in that particular market, right? The static profit of the firm is simply just the variable profit minus the total fixed cost that firm pays and minus the total sunk cost. Because firms also are forward-looking, so when they choose the optimal set of countries to import this year, they would consider not only the static profit, but also the change, the effects on the expected future value as well. Okay. So now, as I mentioned earlier, is that estimating the sunk cost is difficult because of the feature in the model. So first, because of the interdependent across country, we're facing a large combinatorial problem. And it is complicated by the dynamic feature because now potentially we have to compute the value function for every single choice. So that means that the standard method that we use to estimate a dynamic discrete choice model is no longer feasible. And there's method out there to deal with the large choice set, but these methods are not suitable for a dynamic setting. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to use a moment inequality method. This method is introduced in the IO literature and is first introduced to the international trade literature by Morlet, Shu, and Zahler. So here's the basic about this method. I'm going to assume a reveal preferences assumption. That is the observed part of the firm is the optimal for them, of course, given their information set. And that implies any deviation that we make from this observed path is going to lower the firm expected profit. And using these observations, I'm going to create a series of deviations in the following way. I'm going to change the firm decision at time t, but I will keep the firm decision as a time constant. So that's going to create two advantages here. First, when I only change the period at one time, that is at only time t, then the profit of the firm at t and t plus 1 will change. But for any period after t plus 1, there should be no change in the firm profit. And therefore, the difference in the firm dynamic profit is going to be reduced to the difference in the firm static profit for only 2 periods. Now, but note that this result here is relies on the fact that sunk costs fully depreciate after 1 year. If sunk costs depreciate after a longer period of time, then we potentially would have to account for not only change in t and t plus 1, but also for other longer time horizon. And this method here can account for that. But I choose that sunk costs depreciate after 1 year because here I'm only have a short panel. And if we allow for a longer horizon, then we would gonna lose more observations, right? And then the second advantage of this procedure is that we only need to analyze choices that are very similar to the observed path. So in a sense, we are making the assumption that firm choosing among a small set of very similar choices instead of considering own possible choices to find the global maximizations. Right? So that's going to reduce the number of choices that we have to analyze substantially. All right, I'm going to provide like a very simple example of how I'm creating these deviations. This is a hypothetical import path for a firm from 4 different countries, A, B, C, and D in 3 different years. Now let's focus on the firm decision in time t. So in this year, the firm import from A and B, but not C and D. Then I'm going to create 4 different deviations in the following way. First one, I will change the firm decision in country A from 1 to 0, but I will keep the firm decision in other country constant and also in other year constant. And I will do the same for B, C, and D by changing their decision. If it's 1, and turn it to 0 and vice versa. So with this way, when we have J countries, then the number of deviations is going to be J's instead of 2 to the power of J's as in a typical optimization problem. Then from each of these deviations and under the reveal preferences assumptions, now we can get the bound for the cost of importing. If we look at A and C here, we can see that this firm already import from A and C. And so this firm only has to pay the fixed cost of importing to A and C, and therefore we get the bound for the fixed cost. Then with deviation 2 and 4, we can get the bound for both the fixed and the sunk cost for the sum of the fixed and sunk cost because the firm did not import from B and D in the last period. Right? Now, so that is then the next step that we have to deal with is that how do we quantify the change in the revenue of the firm when we deviate from the firm observed set. So the fixed and sunk cost heavily relies on this term, which is the marginal revenue of a country. And as we have seen in the model part, that we actually have a closed form expression for this term, and therefore it's actually quite straightforward to estimate. All right. So the data that I'm using to estimate this model will come from the Chinese custom data in combination
Sorry,
with...
before you
yes.
jump in there, sorry, I probably should have asked this question earlier, but so I'm trying to think about, you know, what's the static interdependence is giving us and what the dynamic interdependence is giving us. So in the static sense, you know, I want to think that suppose, just to fix ideas, think of an example. The US puts a tariff on imports of a particular product from China. So I think about a US firm that imports from China. And so now this is a shock that has driven up the price of those imports. So I want to know what is the impact on its imports from other countries. And because of the interdependence, suppose that firm only pays a fixed cost to import from a country, there's still going to be an interdependence there, right?
So let me make sure that I understand the questions here. Now, if the US impose a tariff on, say, China, and what's going to happen is that, you know, for the static versions of this, is that that's not only going to affect the US firm decision to import from China, but also affect the US firm decision to import from other countries.
Exactly, yeah.
Because of the interdependence, yes.
Yes. And so that interdependence is there, you know, even without having sunk costs.
Yeah. So the interdependent and the static, yeah. But then what happened is that after the trade war is over, right, we're going to see a long-term effect on countries that is not just China and US because of the interdependence that happened in the first period.
Okay. So this is trying to say, okay, let's say a standard model we've got some kind of independence of irrelevant alternatives thing that, let's say, the US putting tariffs on China should not affect, should not affect, say, its imports from Vietnam relative to India. It should only affect China relative to Vietnam and China relative to India, but not sort of the relative of Vietnam and India.
Yeah, exactly.
With the fixed cost, that is no longer true because now a tariff on China should affect relative imports from Vietnam and India. And then with a sunk cost, this effect may be persistent. Is that correct?
Yeah. The sunk cost is going to create the persistent, of this third country effect. Is there any other questions? Okay, if not, then I'd like to continue the estimations here. So the data is going to come from the Chinese custom data and the firm level annual survey. I'm also collecting data from a number of sources to obtain information at the country level. And the final sample include about 1,500 chemical producer that import at least 1 year from the top 40 country between 2000 and 2006. Right here. So for the first step, I'm going to compute the marginal revenue at the observed set. So that's going to give us, the change in the firm revenues when we deviate from the observed set. So this formula here is basically from the result we have earlier in the model. And it is a function of two different components. The first one is the total revenue of the firm. So this one here, which we can recover directly from the data. And it's also a function of the elasticity of substitutions, which I recover from the markup. the terms also depends on the country's competitiveness level, which is denoted by this SIJT term here. And I would proxy for this term by using technology, labor cost, and trade cost at this country. And then finally, it depends on the value of the theta, which is the dispersion technology. Similar to AFT and also Ethernet cotton, this theta term here is going to play the role of trade elasticity. And I'm also following this paper to use variation in the labor wage across countries to identify the value of theta. So one implication of this step is that the value of sigma and theta that I get is larger than 1. So that means we have a complementary decrease here, and the marginal revenue of a countries is going to be increasing in the number of countries that a firm is importing from. Also recall that the marginal revenue is a component of 2 factors. First one is the rate of change in marginal cost, which captures the substitution effect across country. And it also captures the total revenue, which basically represent the scale effects across country. And here we can see the interaction between the substitution effect and the scale effects. For example, if we look at the first guy, the guys that never import from a market, we can see that when we add a country to this firm, the rate of change in the marginal cost is quite big. And this is because this firm tend to import from a small number of countries, and therefore the marginal cost saving for them is going to be big. However, the scale effect shows that this firm is operating at a very small scale, and therefore the product of these two is not enough for them to cover both the fixed and sunk costs of importing. On the other hand, if we look at the continuing guy, that is this guy here, we can see that the opposite is happening here. And that is the marginal cost saving for this continuing importer is quite small, but they are operating a big scale. And therefore, the product of these two allows them to cover the fixed cost of importing. Right?
You just go back one slide before this again. So this sigma minus 1 over theta seems to be like the key thing that's driving the results.
So yeah, so this is basically, yes, you are right. So that's gonna change the value of the gain in marginal revenue that a firm get when they add or drop a country.
And just to understand, so where you're recovering this, sigma minus 1 over theta from, there's a the firm level information is coming from this sort of gross markup approach. There's like a firm level way of the firm data is used to get that, but this theta is coming from some international data.
So the theta, the way that I'm estimating this theta is that I'm regressing the input share of at the firm level on the wage, the wage at the country level in order to get theta.
And this seems to be like sort of a really key, since this sigma minus 1 over theta is really key to what's going on here, that sort of telling us a bit more about how this is recovered. And it kind of, the most satisfactory way to think about that would be something where it's this ratio is what you recover rather than separately these parameters, because then if they're not estimated in one step, how do we think about errors in estimation of sigma minus 1 and errors in estimation of theta, and how we would then put bounds on what the ratio of these two parameters is.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Also, I'm going to show you very in just the next few slides is that when we change this value of theta and sigma, how is that going to affect the sunk cost estimate? So I'm going to show that in a couple of slides. But yeah, this is a very good suggestion. Thank you.
Trang, could I have a related question? I've been wondering how you handle the detailed kind of HS code in your data. Conceptually, we were thinking about there are these big chemical producers, I guess you talk about, and they were importing different inputs.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem like it shows up in this specific formula. So I've been wondering.
So the analysis, the analysis I'm conducting here is at the country firm level. basically on the aggregate on the product at the country level for each firm, if that makes sense.
Okay, I see. Yeah, but a lot of it's a little bit, there's a little bit tension there, because a lot of this, what we think about elasticity of substitution will be more across wouldn't that also be more across the inputs rather than also countries?
I see. Yeah, so I see your point. So you're saying that, if they importing like inputs that are more substitute versus, inputs that are more complementary, that also affects the change, the relationship across countries. So that's a very good point. The intuition here is actually similar to Eaton and Cotton's. If you remember, what's going on there is that, even though there's a substitution effect, elasticity of substitution across different variety of outputs, that's eventually does not affect the choice of the firms to like choose which country come from. And so the intuition here is that potentially every country can produce all of these inputs, but the what's driven, like, how whether country are substitute or complement is driven by, the level difference in their technologies, which is captured by the data here. So say, imagine that if countries are very identical in their technology, then they are going to be substitutes, right? Because firm doesn't have the incentive to import from multiple countries if they are just producing very similar identical output. But if countries are very different in their technology, then now we can see, this emerging of comparative advantage across countries. And so we're gonna see that countries are more look like complementarity instead of substitutes. However, if we were to model this decision in a different way, and that is the production functions is a CS aggregator over differentiated inputs, and each input is differentiated by the country origins, right? And in that case, we would see that, whether input are substitute or complementarity is going to affect the relationship across country. So that's a different type modeling, which going to give the same prediction that you was talking about. All right. So, all right. So now let's move to the estimation of the fixed and sunk cost. For exposition purpose in this presentation, I'm going to impose very similar, very simple cost structure here, and that is the fixed cost going to be a sum of a constant term gamma f plus some error term, and the sunk cost will also be a constant term plus some error terms here. In the paper, I allow for a richer structure of the cost. That is, the sunk and fixed cost depends on a number of country characteristics, like distant language or shared continents. And we can also allow for complementarity across country in the fixed and sunk cost as well, similar to what more or less Shu and Zahler's doing with extended gravity. But the key assumption here is that the error term here is gonna be an expectation of error. That is, it is independent of the firm decisions, or a firm does not observe this error term when they make the decision, right? And then under this assumption, and
Trang, can I have a quick question about the fixed cost? So the firm idiosyncratic component, it's like temporary. It's none of the gamma OF is or.
Can you? I'm not sure if I'm following here. So, are you asking?
Do you have firms that are intrinsically better importers in the fixed cost sense?
That is, this one is a function of firm characteristic, right? Let's say like big firm pays smaller sunk costs or fixed costs, and small firm. Yeah, so I can allow for this. I can allow for this gamma f here to be a function of firm characteristic. Which is possible to do. It's just that it's complicated estimations for now.
I mean, I'm just saying, because we know in the data there's not this. I mean, there's not an assorted matching of firm size and import intensity, and those moments kind of do matter for the gains from trade and so on. I was wondering if you can accommodate it with this method.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. So under this assumption and the review preferences assumptions, we can arrive 4 different inequality, moment inequality, which basically correspond to the 4 different deviations that we seen earlier. Now, so from this inequality, one thing I want to note here is that the assumptions on the information set of the firms that we need to derive this inequality is very minimal. So what we need is that firm know what is going on in the marginal revenues, or basically what is creating their static revenue, and we also need the firm to know what they do in the last period and also their decision in the current period. So these are very minimal assumptions, and that's what we make in many different settings. However, we don't have to make any assumptions about the distributions of the error term, or if the firms actually have more information, or the information set of the firm is bigger than what we are assuming, then that's totally fine. The estimation is very flexible in terms of what is going on in the firm information set here. And then next, I'm gonna estimate the inference. I'm gonna conduct inference for this cost parameter using Andrews and Soares 2010. And one thing to note about this method is that it's gonna give us the confidence interval for the 2 parameter value, even when we don't have point identifications here. So here's the main result. This is the 95% confidence set, the joy confidence set for the cost of importing. On the x-axis, we have the cost to that continuing importer pays, or the continuation cost. And then on the y-axis is the entry cost, what the new importer would have to pay. So what I found is that the continuation cost is ranged between about 0.5 to 1.8. And the cost to new importers range between 1 to about 3.2. Even though these 2 values are overlapping, but if we look at the joy estimation here, we can see that the cost to a new importer is bigger than the cost to a continuing importer. For example, if we look at the lower bound of the continuation cost, that is right here, then this is the entry cost is about 1.1. So that implies that the sunk cost, or the difference between these 2, is about 0.6 million RMB. And if we look at this point here, that is the upper bound of the continuation cost. The sunk cost range between, it's gonna range between 0.3 to 0.8. And at some of the extreme point in this set, the difference between the 2 costs can go up to about 2 million RMB. And then this estimate is robust to different cutoff of countries. I also checked whether small firms driven, or is going to affect this result, because this small firm potentially also indirectly import from intermediaries, right? So that may bias the estimate, but I do not see a big difference here. And also exclude foreign firms because those firms potentially can engage in intra-firm trade, and that's they may pay a different sunk cost of importing compared to domestic firm. And here again, I also don't find a very different estimate. Then next, here I'm checking like how the static interdependence is gonna affect the cost estimate here, which is what Doran was asking about earlier. So what I found is that comparing to the baseline estimate, which is a complementary case and presented by the red regions here, when I assume countries to be independent, that is the blue regions, or substitute the green regions here, I found that the fixed and sunk cost estimate also becomes smaller. And the reason is because when countries are moving from complementary to substitutes, the marginal gain of importing from a country also becomes smaller, right? And that means if we actually observe that a firm import from a country, then that must mean that the gain for them is now smaller. Oh, sorry, that must mean that the cost of doing so for this firm also becomes smaller. And this result here also highlight the importance of sunk costs in a world when countries are complementary.
Right?
Yes.
If you scaled those by like some measure of profitability, would they all basically line up on one another?
They would, yeah.
So it's really not so much that it's just because you're kind of increasing the scale of the return, it just sort of blows everything up. So, okay. There's nothing kind of beyond that. I'm just trying to.
So, So you're right that if we allow for the gains to be bigger, then the cost estimates also become bigger, just by review preferences, right? So there's one thing that I checked earlier, but now I don't remember exactly, so I really don't want to talk too much about it. But there's some asymmetric. There's some asymmetric between adding and dropping when we have interdependent across country. And that is, from the same set of countries, if we add an identical country versus if we drop an identical country, the change in the absolute change in the revenue is not going to be the same in the case of interdependence. But I do not exactly remember the reason. It's somewhere in the paper.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, so for the next step, what I'm doing here is that I'm allowing for some learning from importing here. And the motivations come from the fact that there's a lot of result in the import literature that firm increase productivities when they have asset to input. And also, if there's actually learning from importing, that can potentially explain the persistence in the firm import status. So basically, I'm assuming that the productivity of firms here is going to be a function of the firm import status in the last period. And under these assumptions, there's going to be a second intertemporal linkage between the firm current and future profit, besides the links through the sunk cost. But then we would face with a new estimation challenge, and that is whenever we change the firm decision this period, that's not going to change the firm sunk cost in the future, but also change the revenue of the firm in the future as well. So basically, we have to predict, or we have to find ways to get at the change in future revenue once we deviate from current period. So I'm going to address that problem by using an observation that the revenue of the firm is the functions of the demands factors that come in across firm productivity here, and also the third term here is the input price index for the firm. And then plug in the previous equations for the productivities here in these equations here. We can get our estimating equation for the revenues. So the revenue is going to be, functions of the some characteristic of the firm import state in the last period. This second term here is what we can actually estimate from the earlier step, that is basically capture the input cost that firm pays, and then a set of year dummy to capture the common demand factor across firm, right? Now, the one problem here is that the error term in this equation is gonna include the productivities in the last period, which is correlated with the firm import decision in the last period. So we have here is that XIT here is an endogenous term. And I address this problem by using input tariffs in China between 2000 and 2006 as IV. Then once we have a estimate for eta, then we can estimate the change in the future revenues when we add or drop a countries from the firm current import set. Okay. So here's the new result. The red regions here is the baseline result we see, and then the productivities, and the blue regions here is what we get if we allow for productivities gain, or if we allow for firm to internalize the future productivity gains and increase in revenue. So I mean, this is not really interesting because, like Josh said, if we increase the gain in importing, then we can also see that the estimate for the fixed and sunk costs also become bigger, right? So what I'm doing in the second graph here is that I scale everything by the gains in the import revenue of the firms, and now we can see an interesting pattern, and that is for the continuation costs. We see that the lower bound is now becoming bigger, right? So it's moving to the right here. But for the entry cost is now becoming a little bit smaller. So the upper bound is now smaller here. So what we see here is that relatively the gains, the productivity gains for continuing importers seem to be bigger than the relative productivity gains for a new importers here. And that's show up here in the second graph. Right? So let's see, I have 10 minutes, right? Okay, should be enough. So then for the final slide here, I'm gonna show the estimation in a slightly modified model in which I allow for firms to not only import intermediate goods from multiple countries, but also export their final good to multiple markets as well. And the rationale behind this exercise is that we observe a lot of firms engage in international trade through multiple channels. So not just importing or not just exporting, but usually they would conduct both at the same time, right? So is there any complementarities or interactions between different trade margins here? So the import side is going to be similar. It's going to be exactly the same as before. And on the export side, I'm going to impose that, against firm pay a variable cost to export. Also, they pay fixed and sunk costs to export as well. And the structure here is very similar to the import side. And so here's a new timing of the firm decisions. They're going to simultaneously choose the set of countries and the set of export destinations at the same time. And then they decide how to, the quantities to import and export from each market. And finally set the price of the final good. And there's going to be two channel for complementarity between export and import in this setting. The first one is going to be in the intensive margins. That is when firm import from more markets, that's going to reduce their marginal cost and therefore increase their export revenue. On the other hand, if firm export to profitable markets, that's going to increase the total revenues of the firm and therefore increase the marginal revenue of import countries for the firm. And the second channel for complementarity between export and import is going to come from the extensive margins, or in particular the sunk cost here. And that is, I allow that if a firm import from a market in the last period, that's going to reduce the sunk cost of exporting in the current period and vice versa. Right? And so even, so now in this setting, we see that problem can become a lot more complicated because the number of choices that firm face is now double. And there's also the interactions between the export and import margins as well. So, however, the estimations of the sunk cost has to be a lot more complicated. And in fact, I'm going to use the same assumption here, and that is whatever that firm is doing is the optimal for the firm, conditional on the information set. And to estimate the import cost, I'm going to keep on the export decision of the firm the same, but create deviation from the import part. And similarly, to estimate the export cost, I'm going to keep on the import decision the same and deviate from the export part, right? And we can use the same intuitions here to, in order to account for other trade margins, for example, multinational productions or offshore R&D, etc. So here's the result for the cost complementarity between the export and import. So on the first graph here, what we're seeing here is the cost to new importers, the entry cost of importing without prior export experience. And then on the y-axis is the entry cost, but those firm has prior export experience in that country. So what we're seeing here is that the, and then the difference between these two is basically the difference between each of these points to the 45 degree is going to show us the potential range of cost reductions when the firm has prior export experience here. And then if we look at the, second graph here, so we can also see that there's potentially some cost reductions for exporting when firm has prior import experience in the same market. And then another thing that I want to point out here is that it seems like the cost of importing is more expensive, is bigger than the cost of exporting. So the cost of importing here on this graph is basically ranging between, let's see, 1 to 4.8. But for the export side, the range of the entry cost for exporting is about between 0.4 to 0.9. So it seems like exporting is somehow cheaper than importing in this setting. Right?
Could I have a question about how do you treat domestic sourcing when you were thinking about the importing decision when you were estimating these costs?
So thing is, I have to normalize the domestic the source of the cost of domestic sourcing. So we can think about this. The cost I'm estimating here is in relative to the the cost of domestic sourcing.
No, I just have this intuition that think about what, all your review preference approach is basically thinking about what do I lose if I don't have it, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then, in some way, your model has been predicting from the importing side, I'm actually importing all the inputs. If I don't have that, maybe there's a huge impact on my domestic revenue too. Where from the export side, you're really thinking about just an export revenue. So isn't that, isn't that just like by nature, it gives you like a magnitude difference? I'm trying to understand, how much being driving by this fact that you were just thinking about, what do I lose? Do I actually even lose my domestic revenue versus I'm only just losing my export revenue in driving the difference between these two?
I see. Yeah, actually, I does make a lot of sense. So if change the import decisions, right? That's affect on the markets that the firm is selling to. So foreign market and also domestic market as well. But if we change the export decision, that's only affect that particular market, but does not affect the other markets.
Yeah, but that's exactly the reason I was asking about domestic sourcing, because maybe it's not that costly, as you think, because you were thinking about if I cannot import this thing anymore, maybe there's a domestic substitute, that I just don't know whether you've been appropriately taking that into account to think about how costly.
Isn't that controlled by theta?
Potential supply.
Remember the theta parameter, the Frechet, isn't that controlling the elasticity of substitution effectively between the foreign inputs, but also this is symmetric, so probably applies to domestic versus all the foreign. Which value did you get, if I may ask?
So theta is 1.9 in my estimate. Yeah. So I think that's a good point. So theta is gonna determine, actually both theta and sigma is gonna determine, like, when I change from one country to another, what is the difference in the revenues that I'm gonna get here, right? Yeah.
But that might talk another point, which is like, then it's really a strong assumption to have IIA. It's like everything's symmetric. So
so the substitution between domestic
to a certain
and
extent will have to be a little bit special, but that's exactly the problem, I think.
So I guess the concern here is that, suppose if there's like a symmetric between domestic input versus like foreign input, and that is the substitution between domestic and foreign is not the same as substituting between different foreign markets, then we can potentially gonna have a different
yeah, exactly.
That's a good point. Okay. Right. So I think if there's no other questions, I think I should conclude here. So basically, in this paper, it is the first study on import dynamics that account for both the sunk cost and interdependence across countries. And I quantify the sunk cost of importing using a moment inequality method. And I also show that, the statics interdependence here that potentially have important implications for the dynamic cost, and also allowing for a richer dynamics in the model by allowing for the firm to increase their productivities by importing. And finally, I also allow for for firms to be able to both import and export to multiple countries. And this is potentially, we can use the same method here to account for other trade margins, and therefore hopefully have a bigger understanding of the firm engaged in the global value chains. So that is the end of my presentations, and I'm happy to stay around for more questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much. That was great. We will open up for questions and comments. Just go ahead and unmute and jump in.
So I'll just follow up real quickly on that final discussion. Is there like some advantage to just kind of in the world restricting just one type of decision, like everyone does exporting, and then we get it's cheaper than like having some firms import, but everyone gets the same access to products? It just seemed like there was somehow in that last figure that it's so much more costly to import, but we could sort of get the same set of products if on the other side everyone was just exporting. Somehow I don't know, it seems like there's almost an asymmetry in your findings. I know when you import, you get to like buy everything from a country, right? And when someone exports to you, he only gets to sort of sell one input. But in some sense, like the products are kind of, you'd expect there to be some sort of symmetry in terms of the costs of like what you're doing, which is, really just accessing, setting up like a way of getting products from the other country. I mean, I think when people import, they're not really importing from like 100 different firms from the same country. So likewise, when you're exporting, you're usually only exporting to one or two firms. I mean, absent what just seem like I would expect there to be, if we'd really think about the costs, they should, what makes it sort of asymmetric going in, if I'm doing importing or I'm doing exporting?
I think we potentially focus too much on the export versus import. There's also a difference, that is the importing is intermediate goods versus the exporting is now we selling final goods. So potentially what's happened is that, if a firm importing inputs, they have to do a lot of due diligence. They want to make sure that they have a quality match with the suppliers, because one bad match potentially gonna ruin the production process, and that's very costly for firm. Versus when a firm sell final goods, right? What is bad is gonna be just that they do not get paid by their buyers. So potentially the cost of a bad match when they sell final goods is smaller than if they have a bad match with a bad input supplier. If that makes sense.
I mean, that sounds like an industry composition, but I guess my idea was, you pretty much have to send the same set of people to go check out the factories, whether you're importing or exporting, and you kind of have to make the same efforts to find people. Why is it somehow, I mean, do we really think that these activities are different? The costs of doing these activities are very different, whether you're the one who's doing the importing or you're the guy on the exporting. So I don't really know. I've never imported or exported. So, but it just seems like there should be some more symmetry someplace, at least not intentionally.
Actually, I agree with you. That's why I say that at the beginning, that I found this somewhat surprising.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense in the structure of the model, but I wonder if the model is like too literal in that when you import, you get to access to like all the products in that country, and right. So, okay,
But just can I say something related? So, Trang, these estimates you showed us are from the point of view of Chinese manufacturing firms.
Exactly.
Right. And these are related by to the prevalence of importing and exporting. So maybe the underlying data for China happens to be that there's just more prevalent, exporting is more prevalent than importing. And George's point was more like a global, that things should add up when you look at the two sides of the market.
I see. I see.
That could be another reason why you have asymmetry.
Yeah. So potentially, if there's like from a Chinese firm, the trade cost of importing is different from exporting. That's potentially explain the difference. So if we want to really look at the symmetry between export and import, we potentially want to look at like the same transactions, right? And then look at like how much the buyers incur the cost and how much the seller incurs the cost within the same transactions here. Is that what you mean?
So there are these surveys where they go and they ask a firm, they say, what efforts, what did you have to do to become an importer? What did you have to do to become an exporter? Like, how much time did you have to spend? It would be interesting to know if there's really a systematic difference in terms of the activity, or if it's just something about the way we write the models, where when you import, you get access to like all of the products in that country, and that, obviously a 1% increase in productivity, through an elasticity is going to get scaled up, and so the return has to be so much bigger to sort of limit what people are doing. But I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I know what the models tell us, right? But I don't know what the business people somehow tell us. I don't know if we should ever trust them, but yeah. I don't know.
But,
I mean, like, so the papers that think about like bilateral matching, I think Daniel's done some work on this. You know, is there some asymmetry in like the way, you know, on either side of the transaction? I can stop talking too.
Yeah, we find that the sellers pay more than the buyers for search.
Oh, I see. and what is the intuition behind that?
No intuition. It's just what comes out of the data. We'll find one eventually, I think.
That's what Jim spent the past 3 weeks on.
Yeah. I'll tell you next week. If I were Kim, I would say, well, don't exporters take a couple of years to ramp up to their full volume? And given that what you're seeing when they start exporting isn't their long run level, is that going to bias your sunken fixed costs? Or put differently, is there a version of this model where you can handle that, or does that ruin the fun?
Oh, so are you suggesting that maybe over like a time horizon, a new importer is behaving different from a new exporter? Right?
I'm not thinking so much about importer versus exporter, just that either one is going to take a few years to build up a client base and so on. And so their exports you see in the first year, particularly if you have partial year effects going on, are going to be less than what you see in other years.
I see.
So they may take losses in the first year relative to their sunken fixed costs, realizing that down the road they're going to be able to get up to speed.
That's a good point. I think what I can do is that I can look at, accounting for, when we deviate from, say, the export decision this year, how that's going to affect the firm revenue in the next period. If we think that, if I export today, I would potentially suffer a loss today, but I gain more in the next period, then potentially the cost that we estimate at that point is going to be bigger, right? Is that the idea?
Yeah. Exactly.
So what I can do is that I can look at, how the decision today affect the revenue in the next period, and then account for that when I estimate the fixed and sunk cost of exporting. So that potentially would give us a bigger estimate for the fixed and sunk cost. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Could I also ask you something that at the very beginning, actually, Dorian also asked you a question. I think seems like your big motivation is about third country effect, even from the country level, right? And then later when you do this extension, that aspect didn't really show up anymore. And I've been keep thinking, for instance, U.S.-China has like this trade war. We typically thought that Vietnam and India benefited. And then from an individual firm perspective, if I was sourcing from China, what elements in your model are going to tell us that I'm going to switch my sourcing to Vietnam and India? I don't think it's in your model yet, but that might be a good kind of like a big kind of like additional thing you could do rather than just kind of like go very broadly to like exporting all these divisions. But that might need you to relax yourself from this kind of symmetric CS world, I guess, because right now you don't have that feature. There's no Vietnam or India in your model.
So
right?
Yeah, I guess if I understand what you're saying correctly, there's no effect of like, say I increase tariff on Chinese goods. There's no like, how can I know what's going to happen in India or Vietnam, right? Yeah. So right now,
because it's IA, right? It's China's share gonna allocate it to the other countries' share just based on their previous share. There's no disproportionate benefit from, even from individual firm perspective, sourcing decision. I don't see that channel being coming.
But yeah. Sorry, I'm confused because I thought the whole point here was because the fixed costs are country specific.
I don't think it's country specific. Is that
country specific?
It has to be.
It's country specific. So
okay.
Oh,
then maybe there's something.
Let's see how should I explain this. Each of this country is characterized by a couple of different factors. So first there is fixed and sunk cost, that is country specific. But then also on the intensive margins, country also differ in their technology level, trade costs, and also labor costs as well. So let's say that we have, the decision for firms to move to substitute China and say another countries like Vietnam is going to be a comparison of these different characteristics that, do they have same fixed costs or technology level, labor costs, etc. Right?
But if they're in this case, can you show that? Maybe that'll be really interesting. If you can show, that. Right.
So if I can show, if like firm do not import from China and they change.
No, it's like what kind of features been driving a closer third country substitution effect? In a way that it'd be really the lesson we can take from your exercise in terms of what countries being cut. If I get shock one specific country, who's going to be benefiting?
I see.
Can I give an example of maybe, I don't know, my intuition says this is happening. I don't know whether your model says this is happening. So let's say we rank, I don't know, China is cheapest, and then comes Vietnam, and then comes India. And so I, as a firm, I start off and I'm sourcing, there's some fixed costs. I source from China and Vietnam. And then suddenly China becomes more expensive. So then I shift out of China, I drop China, and now I'm importing from Vietnam and from India. So that now because of the fixed cost, I wasn't importing from India before. So now we have this, we don't have this IIA property because we have a shift in the relative imports from Vietnam and India. Okay, so that's with fixed costs. Now with sunk costs, then let's say that China tariff disappears, but now I'm just going to stick around with my importing from Vietnam and India, and I'm not going to go back to importing from China because I've already paid this big sunk cost to shift my sourcing pattern. I mean, that's a kind of a story where if you could say something about that, I think that would be, as Daniel was saying, that would be super interesting.
I see. Thank you. That's good suggestions.
Does your model let you do counterfactuals, or is it just impossible? I assume you may have multiple equilibrium issues here.
So it's not possible to do counterfactuals right now with the moment inequality methods. And so there's a couple of reasons. First is that I only have a range for the parameter values. And so I do not make assumptions about the unobserved factors here. So if we were to do counterfactuals, we potentially have to relax a lot of heterogeneity in the models here. Or make stronger assumptions on some of the unobserved heterogeneities. Yeah.
But even if you did, suppose you choose a vector of parameters and you choose some random draws, could you solve it and then bump the equilibrium with a tariff change?
Sorry. So if I fix a, just
take a parameter vector. I don't.
So just fix like a fixed and sunk cost. So it's kind of complicated because we have interdependent here and the sunk cost, right?
Yeah.
We know how to deal with this result for a dynamic model without interdependence, and also there's result for a static model without sunk cost. With interdependent, but without sunk cost. So we know how to deal with that, but we don't know how to derive general equilibriums when there's both interdependent and sunk cost. That's that would deserve an entire new paper.
Yeah, it sounds ambitious.
I guess that made me realize just how little I understood. So I mean, I guess so I was going to ask a question like how do you match the life cycle pattern? But I guess all of this is really just you're backing out a set of costs that can match the data, right? And so by definition, you're matching the life cycle pattern of kind of like the typical firms in the window that you have, or is that right?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Josh, that's the beauty of I/O. You can estimate something, but you cannot compute it.
It's amazing. It's just It's so cool.
Data speaks.
No, that's right. That's really great. So I keep learning something new.
What
you guys
you
all
say?
knew that I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, I this paper, I don't know if it's count as an IO paper or a macro paper. When I presented to the board, right, that was my concern. Like, do people think that this I should present general equilibrium effect here? But,
Can I ask you? So you had this part where you had like learning about productivity from importing.
Yes.
I was thinking, like, in general, there's a lot of experience in actually importing, right? And so the sunk cost, fixed cost structure it's not kind of ideal. If we kind of look at like how history matters for how long exit rates from exporting or exit rates from importing, I'm assuming are the same. Have you given some thought to like separating out like these productivity gains versus just the kind of learning by the kind of the knowledge you accumulate in the activity of importing and exporting? So it's not really kind of moving your revenue, it's really moving like your fixed costs.
So like the fixed cost is changing over time.
Yeah, it's, you can kind of think about like
years that I see. So what I can do is that I can estimate a separate set of fixed costs depends on the firm. So what is going on? Let me show there. Is that I can allow for the fixed cost functions to be a fixed cost to be a function of the firm experience in the foreign markets, right?
Okay.
So that's there'll be a new parameter to estimate.
Gotcha.
Assuming that if firm stay longer in the market, is decrease the fixed cost that firm pays, right? So that's something I can definitely do.
I mean, because it feels like the model is the way it's set up right now. Somehow it feels like pretty much when you go in almost everywhere. If all the markets were kind of the same, the only thing that would kind of keep you from going in almost everywhere is just you drew something that's really high. So in some markets, or some markets were like particularly costly to enter. But I'm just trying to understand, like, is there any way of differentiating between like there's learning by being in the marketplace versus these kind of draws?
Well,
I mean, I know you're kind of matching the trajectories always, but you're kind of forcing it to kind of go through, there being a lot of noise in the draws that you have to explain why guys don't enter into like, lots of markets at the same time, right? But you might think that it's, it's too costly to kind of enter into all the markets at the same time. So maybe the experience parameter I want is like the total number of markets you've been in or something like that, as opposed to just how long you've been in one individual market. You know what I mean?
I see, but I feel like there's something about, I'm not sure if we, I may not following you, but it feels like there's something about a global sunk cost of exporting or importing here as well, right? So let's say there may be like a increasing return to scale in the sense that, if I import from, or decreasing return to scale, that is, if I import from more countries, and it's just become more costly for me. If that makes sense. Yeah, so you were hinting at?
I mean, listen, if we think that there's learning on how to produce, there must be learning on how to find suppliers.
So
that's an alternative story for why you kind of see guys diffusing slowly, is that they're,
I see.
And there are people on the export side who have said, listen, there's learning about different, either yourself or the activity.
I see.
And so history does matter.
In the sense that, say if the cost for me to import from the second market is lower than the cost for me to import from the very first market, right? Because I'm learning something.
Because I have some experience,
Yeah, because I have some experience in the first market. I see that. So if I import from more then I have a smaller cost. But at the very beginning, it's just very costly to import from all of these countries at the same time because I don't gain this experience.
Yeah. I mean, the president of the company has to be on the jet the whole time and can't watch the factory anymore. So it's,
yeah. I see. That's interesting. Okay.
Just a thought.
All right, this seems like probably a good time to kill the YouTube stream.
All right, so this is